When it came to protest in America, for a while it seemed to lay dormant throughout my high school and collegiate years. There was a sense of apathy through the 1990s and 2000s. Then, after I graduated from college, something happened. A match was lit politically. Then, gas was poured on it. And then, airplane fuel.
Anti-white! 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 Anti-fascista! Anti-fascista!
That's what led me to this subject. It hit home as the Charlottesville riot could have happened anywhere in America. And I was angered that someone who initiated such a tragedy went to the same college as me and had the same degree I have.
Do you have any accountability for this death at all?
Not at all. These radical leftists are the ones that brought violence. They're the ones preparing for violence. They said in their chants, kill the Nazis, kill the fascists. They came prepared for war. They're the ones that tried to kill us.
I soon realized in all of this the importance of the Bill of Rights. First and 14th Amendment protests take many forms. And in that sense, I couldn't fathom how we got to this point in America through the history of protest. This is a look at some big collegiate protests through American history. How have students spoken up using their First and 14th Amendment rights on campus? I traded in some airplane miles and got the keys to some rental cars, and I traveled the country to find out all the answers. Our First Amendment road trip started at a school in Baltimore, Maryland. Towson, Maryland, home of Towson University, one of the first schools to initiate the time, place, and matter policy. Towson treated me well in the 4 years I went there from 2004 to 2008. But it was after I graduated that things started to get a little weary on the First Amendment side of things. This was for the student body at the university, and as an alumni, I took notice. Towson was one of the first schools in the nation to implement a freedom of speech code, which later became the, quote, time, place, and manner policy, which other schools have as well.
When the time, place, and manner policy was enacted, the student government was not consulted. And when we did hear about the policy, we were upset. We did protest. The policy was originally floated to the Student Leadership Council instead of the student government, which really upset members of the student government who were democratically elected versus the Student Leadership Council, which is a hand-picked group of leaders by the Vice President of Student Affairs, which is inherently less democratic. So we did protest. We wanted the policy to be reworked with input from the students, and the administration did end up, taking our input and redoing parts of the policy.
So how do schools circumvent the First Amendment? For public colleges and universities and officials, sometimes when they take actions that are overly restrictive of student speech, they don't actually tend a lot of the time to state, we don't like your message. Instead, where a lot of disputes happen with institutions are over what are called time, place, and manner restrictions. In other words, when you can speak on campus, where you can speak on campus, if you have to get a permit or prior permission to speak on campus. And so that's actually how a lot of times that institutions, in my view, can be overly restrictive when it comes to student speech. So for instance, among public colleges and universities, it's a diminishing number, but you still have some that will have pretty small areas on campus. They'll call them designated speech zones or free speech areas. And the university will inform students through its policy that this is where you can engage in speech and expressive activity and protest. But the rest of the campus or many other areas on campus, that's not open for you to engage in speech or expression.
Free speech zones really became very popular during the 60s and 70s during both the Vietnam and civil rights protests. Where campuses would identify a specific spot, a lawn or a part of a quad where any kind of speech could occur without having to have a permit. In recent years, those free speech zones have been challenged increasingly, and so we're finding campuses moving away from those, and instead in public spaces that exist on campus to allow speech to occur at any time, any place, any way, and not restrict those.
Creating these zones where free speech is acceptable, I think, is to the students' detriment. And it also creates a tool for the administration to punish students if they somehow step out of the bounds of the policy that they've enacted.
So safe space is a concept. It's not actually a place. So when people say they want to have safe spaces for students, they're really talking about places that could be where students can gather and talk about common issues or common areas of concern. Classic example would be a multicultural center, a place where students who have different racial or ethnic identities can come together and talk about some of the issues related to their particular race or ethnicity. And so it's more of a concept rather than as a physical or a temporal space on campus. Very different than a free speech zone, which is actually literally a physical space.
We found out at Towson University about the time, place, and manner policy. However, that shows you that schools have to allow you the right to protest, though they can limit where you can do it. But what happens when schools are protested by outside forces and the government? For those answers, I had to fly down to Oxford, Mississippi, and Ole Miss to look at integration in 1962.
Where's the line between speech and crime, and when does speech become illegal speech, or when can speech be disciplined? Speech that incites violence is not protected, but it has to actually be a danger of inciting imminent violence.
First day at Ole Miss. The very first day at Ole Miss, I was ahead of the game. James Meredith and the United States government won one day. And every day before that, we'd been losing. Every day since that, we'd been losing.
It is a very, very dark chapter in the history of the university and the history of Mississippi.
In the days leading up to September 30th, 1962, tensions were high in the state of Mississippi. Then Governor Ross Barnett was looking toward an election year and had to connect with voters. The hot-button issue was segregation. Ross Barnett had found a way to reach voters by taking on the task of denying James Meredith, a service member and student at nearby Jackson State University, a chance to transfer into the University of Mississippi in Oxford.
It was the position of the leadership of the university and the governor of the state of Mississippi that a black man would not go to school where white young women attended school, that the races would not be housed in the same university.
It was only after an 11th-hour deal with Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, and a presidential decree from John F. Kennedy that Meredith was allowed to enter the university and register.
Americans are free, in short, to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For in a government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law.
Mr. Meredith was escorted on campus to begin his time at the University of Mississippi. Students discovered where Mr. Meredith was and began to protest. That became ultimately a riot. And I want to make sure that I make the distinction between what is a riot and what is rebellion. Very often in history, particularly in history regarding incidents that happen with people of color, they are determined to be riotous conduct instead of rebellion. These students, however, acted in a manner that was riotous, and history records it as same. Unfortunately, It was not just the students on the campus, but other rabble-rousers, people from the KKK. There were calls by white supremacists to ensure that Mr. Meredith was not welcomed at the University of Mississippi, and there were attempts on his life. That resulted in what is commonly referred to now as the Ole Miss riots.
Violence ensued, including the death of a couple civilian individuals who happened to be present. One was a French journalist. We recently erected a statue honoring James Meredith because we acknowledge now that the steps that James Meredith made coming to campus were truly courageous steps that most of us, I don't think, would have had the courage to take. And he not only took those steps, but moved the university in a brand new direction.
It was very emblematic of the tensions and struggles in the South, and the Deep South especially, to maintain systems of segregation. And so Meredith's enrollment was an important event. We also had events that would take place at other Southern institutions. For instance, many people are familiar with George Wallace and the stand in the schoolhouse door. That involved the integration of the University of Alabama, which did not rise to the level of violence that we had with the Meredith enrollment. But it was very significant in this institution's history, but more nationally over efforts to end the formal and legal segregation that existed in the South.
The issues in 1962 were not so much First Amendment issues as they were issues of equal protection. The Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education. It was decided that you could not have separate but equal classrooms. That's just a falsity, that you can possibly give students two totally separate systems and expect them to be equal, especially when you look at the resources that society was putting into white schools compared to African American schools. James Meredith came here because he had the right to equal protection of law. Individuals came to campus to protest his attendance, but a peaceful protest is a far cry from a riot. And once you cross over a line into violence, your speech is no longer protected because you're not engaging in speech anymore. You're engaging in crime.
In addition to being the Vice President of Legal Affairs for the University of Mississippi, Donna Gurley co-wrote a paper dealing with the legality of revoking collegiate diplomas, focusing on the First Amendment.
The Bill of Rights of the Constitution protects individuals from actions by the government, actions by both the federal government and the state government. And if you are a public institution, then you have a duty to protect a student's First Amendment rights, the Constitution itself. A private university has much more leeway when it comes to revoking a degree based on someone's speech.
This brings us back to Towson University and a case study about one student who was admitted.
Go, 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 go! Get out! Get out!
This is Matthew Heimbach, Towson graduate, organizer of the Charlottesville riots, and leader of the Traditionalist Worker Party.
So as far as I know, Matt Heimbach sort of came on the radar at Towson when he started Youth for Western Civilization, which was, a recognized group around the country. It was a white nationalist group. And the controversy there was that he was actually trying to seek official recognition by the university, to be recognized as a club, to receive certain funding. And he actually had a faculty advisor for that, Mr. Richard Vatz, who I believe is still a professor there. And there was a really rough time at Towson. I think that was the first time that I actually saw people protesting. I saw people actually pushing back against what we see very commonly now, which is, a lot of white supremacist activity on college campuses.
Well, white supremacy as a general concept still constitutes protected speech under the First Amendment because the First Amendment doesn't allow for just viewpoint-based discrimination. That being said, not everything that a white supremacist says is itself protected. So if a white supremacist, for example, were engaging in behavior that amounted to a true threat to an identifiable person or groups of persons, if they were engaging in conduct that met that incitement to violence test we spoke about a minute ago, that wouldn't be actionable. But the courts have strongly disfavored what's called prior restraints of stifling people before they say things. Usually with unprotected speech, when it's unprotected, it means that you can take action afterwards. Whereas with most free speech, it's unpunishable and you can't take, remedial action.
Usually when you think about regulating somebody's content, it's like, okay, we're going to let liberal speakers speak on campus, but we're not going to let the alt-right speak on campus. And so that would be a content-based regulation, and that would be improper.
There's a very narrow line there. I think after Charlottesville, we saw a lot of colleges reject Richard Spencer on the premise that, he was advertising that essentially his reps were advertising that these college campuses could be the next Charlottesville. So they seized on that and they said, you know what, you're essentially threatening to do what you did in Charlottesville to our college campuses.
During his time on campus, Matthew Heimbach created a chapter of the White Student Union. Its mission was to do nightly patrols of campus and protect against the black and Jewish population. This was represented by the Black Student Union and Hillel.
Now, this is an off-campus group that has one of our students in it, and they're claiming to be the White Student Union Towson. They're not. They won't be patrolling in crime patrols because we don't have students doing that, and we don't have community members doing that. We have a police department that does that. So there's no accuracy in this, including the crime statistics they're supporting. We have very, very low crime rate here on campus.
Towson, even though it is outside Baltimore, which does have a very high crime rate, itself is relatively low. But Matt felt that there was some sort of pervasive crime on the campuses. So he organized these night walks, in theory, in his own words, to protect the campus, right? But it was really to sort of organize these citizen arrests almost of minority students, if you would see them. And I don't think that actually happened. I think a lot of what he was saying was bluster, because a lot of what he was saying didn't actually follow through.
And I thought, well, maybe we should talk about the double standards that are apparent on campus. And they wrote Black Power and Black Pride in chalk all around the campus during Black History Month. So YWC, we decided that let's just expose the double standard. And we took all the slogans that the Black Student Union had written on our campus and just changed the word black to white. So, like white pride and celebrate white history and things like that.
While he was a student at Towson University, Matthew Heimbach and the rest of the White Student Union were protested by students.
They held several meetings with hundreds of students condemning us for being, again, evil, racist, fascists, just for doing the exact same thing the Black Student Union did on campus, but saying the same thing for white students.
The petitions went on deaf ears from the university, and Heimbach was allowed to graduate.
Towson University is in the right to say no to a controversial speaker like Matt Heimbach if he causes a safety disruption to campus. That's the law. However, that's a very high bar. A lot of people say that anybody should be given a platform, particularly in a public institution, because that's what they were created for. They are bastions of free speech. So a lot of college administrators support that. A lot of college students do not support that. They grew up in this era of speech codes and anti-bullying at high schools. So they bring that with them, and they bring this politicized climate with them and a lot of controversy. So there's this difference in generations. There's the administrators who recognize what a university is meant to be, and then there's the college students who think there should be more limits. So in that way, Towson, if we're speaking legally, absolutely has a legal obligation to allow Matt and similar people to speak. But if there is a potential safety disruption, again, we can look at Charlottesville here, then there can be limits.
Even though Towson will not revoke Heimbach's diploma, Towson is taking steps in the right direction to eliminate hate on campus. In 2017, they initiated, shortly after the Charlottesville debacle, a campaign called #NotAtTU. It focuses on erasing the hate rhetoric on campus for good.
It's a rare circumstance when a degree is conferred and then it would be taken away. And that may actually be dependent on the actual contractual relationship the institution has with the student. So it may vary from institution to institution whether that degree can actually be removed or taken away once conferred. But it certainly is possible if you have a deferred degree upon someone and they engage in really abhorrent behavior.
Matt earned his diploma. He went through the classes just because he was promoting terrible views. Doesn't mean he didn't complete his college credits. You know, Towson made the decision to admit him. You know, he probably wasn't putting on his college application, I'm a white nationalist, but he went through that process and he earned those college credits.
If a student engages in conduct before graduating and the university is aware of that conduct, then the university is under an obligation to bring a student conduct charge during the time the student's enrolled and before the degree is awarded.
Some examples of diplomas being revoked are Bill Cosby, who had his diploma revoked from the University of Missouri following his sexual misconduct trial. Another example, which was not an honorary degree, came from Harvard University. Harvard took away the diploma granted to Donald H. Heathfield, whose real name was Audrey Berzuvkov, a Russian spy posing as a dead person. Knowing these examples are out there, it is perfectly possible for a school such as Towson to revoke Heimbach's diploma, though they will not. Towson would also not comment after repeated trips to the school. Speaking of Harvard, when it comes to First Amendment rights of students being broken on campus, the Crimson School is no angel.
There are schools that, in addition to their policies, have egregiously over and over and over again violated their students' rights with real controversies. Harvard, in particular, has been a particularly egregious abuser of student free speech rights.
I decided I wanted to try and visit the Cambridge, Massachusetts school, attempting to find out about their protest policies on campus. Harvard shot not only me down by email, addressing me with a quote-unquote Dear John letter, but they also made it absolutely clear that they wanted nothing to do with this documentary. I decided to turn my attention elsewhere and keep my quest to find out about the history of college protests going. I went to Kent, Ohio, home of one of the darkest days in collegiate history, May 4th, 1970. It was to find out where the government can intervene in students' rights to protest and the repercussions it faces by doing so.
Now we're going to put a stop to this for this reason. The same group that we're dealing with here today, and there's 3 or 4 of them, they only have one thing in mind, that is to destroy higher education in Ohio. And if they continue this, and continue what they're doing, they're going to reach their goal for the simple reason that you cannot continue to set fires to buildings that are worth $5 and $10 million because you cannot get replacement from the High General Assembly. And last night, I think that we have seen all forms of violence, the worst. And when they start taking over communities, this is when we're going to use every part of the law enforcement agency of Ohio to drive them out of Kent. We are going to eradicate the problem.
She was a little younger than me. We recognized each other when we went to Kent, that we had known each other earlier. And then we'd see each other around campus or demonstrations. Sandy Scheuer I met through a fraternity brother who had dated her, and we became friends, and we hung out together a couple of times, and I saw her quite a bit on campus. So I was an active protester at Kent during the anti-war movement. We had a lot of meetings. We passed out leaflets. We organized teach-ins. We marched.
So the story of May 4 really starts on Thursday, April 30th. It is a typical night, except the president has asked to be on all the major network televisions, and he's going to make a major address. His address involves Cambodia, and he makes the announcement that the United States military will target portions of Cambodia.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. This is the decision I have made. In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border.
His idea, the argument he's trying to make, is that the enemy is using the neutrality of Cambodia to supply the troops in Vietnam. And so he believes, the president, that this is going to end the war faster. But for a lot of people, this is seen as a broken promise, and that's especially true for students and young people, because young people have skin in the game in the Vietnam War. They're the ones being drafted, they're the ones fighting, they're the ones who are seeing their brothers and sisters and relatives killed and going to war and not knowing if they're going to return. I would say of all the artifacts in the museum that change students' opinion, that are impactful, this is probably the most significant. This is the draft board, and the draft is so important to understanding May 4, 1970. We always have the students call out their numbers.
Okay, so with number 195 or below, called for active duty. On February 7th is my birthday, so 91 would be the number. So that means I would be going to war.
For a lot of people, this is seen as a broken promise, and there are protests across the nation. And here on May 1st, right here at the Victory Bell, there's a protest. It's smallish for the time, big for today, 500 people approximately. And they bury the Constitution because they see the president's announcement as a violation of the Constitution. But that night here in Kent, things got out of hand because it's a Friday night and it's a nice day. It's sunny, it's been a tough winter, and a lot of people go out. And Kent then, as it is today, is known for being a fun scene. There are great bars, lots of music, and lots of people come to town. There's also a basketball game on TV. So people are watching the game, listening to music, and tensions are still high. And there's a motorcycle gang that's doing tricks. I've heard reports that there are protests already planned, and the police do the worst possible thing when things get out of hand. When a bottle's thrown at them and a bonfire is set in the street, they decide to put all the drunken people out into the street. And when they do that, there's vandalism. And when the vandalism comes, the National Guard is put on the alert.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Riot Act has been read. It was read to you.
Still, that may be where it ended, but the next day things got worse. The ROTC was a target here at Kent State for a long time. The ROTC was a symbol of the military on campus. Those students were going to fight in the war. And so, for a long time, there had been protests and conversations about removing the presence of the ROTC, and in fact, across the country, ROTCs were targeted. Kent State wasn't the only one, but that night, Saturday, the ROTC was set ablaze. We don't know exactly who set it. We do know that students tried to prevent the firemen when they came from putting out the blaze.
Then the fire department came, and I remember we were protesting the fire department with the hoses. They were trying to pull the hoses to catch the building. It was a wooden building. So once it became engulfed, it pretty much got wiped out. it wasn't even clear that the fire department was really trying to actively put out the fire.
Cut the hoses. They're stoning the deputies that are up on campus and the firemen and my men. You can advise him of this.
With the ROTC on fire, the National Guard, which had been put on alert the day before, were called in, and the National Guard come on campus. And it's not a small number. It's hundreds of guardsmen. They are everywhere.
That really changed things because there was a curfew. We were a militarized campus. And that spelled trouble because even people that were not against the war or not active against the war, people didn't really have political views, suddenly became enraged when they saw National Guard troops on the campus and shutting down the campus. And that galvanized people. And I saw them with the bayonets, the rifles, and I thought, boy, this is bizarre. I'd never seen that before.
But on Sunday, Governor Rhodes, who is running to be a senator, and just like today, is trying to seem tough on crime, he comes and he gives a speech that inflames the situation.
There has to be some way of getting some subsidy for these people to fight, and these people just move from one campus to the other and terrorize the community. They're worse than the brown shirt and the communist element and also the night riders and the vigilantes. They're the worst type of people that we harbor in America. And I want to say this, they're not going to take over a campus. And the campus now is going to be part of the county and the state of Ohio.
And so they called for this protest on Monday, May 4th. And that protest grew because of all that had happened on the weekend to be about so much more. There was guards all around campus. There was still the smell of a burning building on campus. And you had confusion about who was in charge. And you had the guard telling you that students could not protest.
On a particular day of May 4th, I walked out with a friend of mine, Norm Duffy, and we're standing on Taylor Hall, which is near where the visitor center is. And I looked out across the commons and students were gathering around the Victory Bell. And so a Jeep drove out and said, "This rally is illegal, go home." And that was very confusing what home was. So I said to my friend, "Let's go down and talk to the students." Just then somebody yelled, "Here they come." And the National Guard started coming across the commons. When they got about halfway across the commons, they started tear gassing. The students gathered around the Victory Bell and also people just standing there. I went up the hill past what we call a pagoda, which is a concrete structure. Down through the parking lot is the Prentice Hall parking lot. And I looked out some distance away. The dorm, Centennial Hall, was not there at the time. I saw a student laying on the ground. It turned out to be a blind student who had been tear gassed. I gave him some first aid, told his friend what to do. I walked to the edge of the Prentice Hall parking lot. Just then the guard had been moving back up towards the pagoda. When they got to the pagoda, we know over 70 soldiers. The right rear echelon or line of guardmen turned and fired. I had been in the Army, so I knew they were firing real bullets, so I dove for cover and was on the ground long enough that the firing went on.
Just stay away. Just stay away. He's a Viet Cong. Viet Cong. Stay away. Stay away.
I hit the ground when the shooting took place, and I lay flat, and I remember people yelling their real guns, "Duck." And it lasted 13 seconds, something like that. And then when I got up, I saw Jeff's body. He was on the pavement in the parking area behind me. He was dead. There was a massive amount of blood from his head.
When the firing stopped, I stood up and I thought, what should I do? When a student who knew me rushed up and said, "Dr. Lewis, those were blanks, weren't they?" And I realized many students thought that the guard were firing blanks, so I began to run around the back of the parking lot saying, "You must leave. Those are real bullets. You must leave."
They got their rifles in. I don't know.
Hey, those rifles are loaded!
I didn't hear an order to fire. There's a lot of controversy about that because they've picked up some recordings over the years that suggest there might have been an order to fire. I can tell you this, they turned in unison and they started to fire together.
Went back into the parking lot and then decided that this was about 15 to 20 minutes after the shooting, that there would probably be a gathering on the Commons. So I went to the Commons, and sure enough, the students were gathered there, and the senior faculty were talking to the students.
One of the forgotten stories of May 4 is that after the students saw their students shot, saw their friends shot, there was another protest here on the Victory Bell. Students sat and demanded that somebody be held accountable. When they had that protest, there are some heroes of this story. One of the heroes is Glenn Frank. He was a geology professor, beloved, and still to this day, the highest recognition of teaching here at Kent State is the Glenn Frank Award, because he saved lives that day. His son, Alan, was part of that protest. He was on the knoll, trying to create something just so that the National Guard was held accountable or something was explained. And the National Guard was ready to fire again. And Glenn Frank negotiated with them to prevent that from happening.
Please listen to me right now. Wait, hold on. Wait a minute, quiet. Talk, Dr. Frank, talk. I don't care whether you've never listened to anyone before in your lives. I am begging you right now, if you don't disperse right now, they're going to move in, and there can only be a slaughter. Would you please listen to me? Jesus Christ, I don't want to be a part of this. Please.
And that was a test of the First Amendment, and perhaps that is the greatest violation, that entirely peaceful protest after students had been fired on when they just wanted answers. I think you can't forget about that part of the story too.
Many of the students got on buses, went to Cleveland, Akron, Ashtabula, Kent, and Kent State closed and began the national student strike.
These people must go immediately to the dormitories or be arrested.
We often get the question, why weren't more people held accountable? Why don't we have more information from the Guardsmen? And some of that is because of the protracted legal battle. There was 10 years of fighting in the courts, more than 10 years, to hold someone accountable. And we do have a statement of regret, which was signed by the Guardsmen who were there on the Hill, along with the governor. And that's as close to an apology as the students and the families of the victims they received.
We know that there were efforts by the FBI to do intelligence at Kent. My phone was tapped where I lived. There were informants.
Your phone was tapped?
Yes.
How do you know?
I filed a Freedom of Information Act request after Kent State, after the shootings, and I got a box of stuff. Most of it was redacted, but there were conversations recorded from where I lived to my home. There were intelligence reports from informants about where I was, what I was doing, who I was associating with.
One guy.
Yeah, there was one guy who was busted. He was a paid informant. He was involved in the Vietnam vets against the war, and he had talked to people in small meetings about getting a gun, and they figured out who he was, and they set him up so that he was delivering the gun, and then they called the police, and the police came in and busted him, and then realized, oh,
he's one of us.
Yeah. With the COINTELPRO program, which was what Hoover set up to infiltrate the student movement, they wanted to, first of all, gather intelligence to see how we organized and who we associated with. Then they also tried to plant suggestions with the informants about doing violent acts so that they could bust us. Somebody is recording a conversation I'm having with Tom Grace.
It wasn't Orville's Walters?
Yeah.
It became Walters.
He's working on the paper. Jerry says the paper will have Madam Bin, chief negotiator for the PRG, on the cover with the New Nation symbol. Do I think J. Edgar Hoover wanted to use this to attack the First Amendment rights of students and the 14th Amendment rights? I think the answer would be yes. I think COINTELPRO was a program behind the scenes. We didn't know about it at the time, but it was clearly an effort to disrupt the left.
After learning about the massacre, it was obvious to see that human rights and not just First and 14th Amendment rights were taken away. But my question is now, what impact has this had on protest and popular culture? For that, I turn to Kent State professor Paul Herodakis.
If you ask people around the country, for example, you ask me where I'm employed, and I say I'm Kent State University. Oftentimes, the first response is May 4th. In popular culture, in the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young song, it's had a major impact. The visitor center that we put together at Kent State was put together in order to memorialize that. Even though these kinds of incidents have a major impact, they still have to be remembered. We still have to do the kinds of things that make sure they never become footnotes in history.
May 4th represents a challenge to civil rights and the right of assembly and the right of free speech. What happened on May 4th was the National Guard, acting as agents of the state of Ohio, took away the right of free speech and freedom of assembly from the Kent State students. That's just simply wrong. And I think that raises questions all over the United States about the legitimacy of protest and right of assembly.
Round, round, get around, I get around, yeah.
In order to understand the right of free speech and assembly, I went back 6 years to the free speech movement in Berkeley, California. There was a massive sit-in which changed the collegiate landscape forever. I hopped on a plane to the Bay Area to go to the University of California at Berkeley.
I think the Berkeley administration, after all of the support we got, after all the activity, I think they felt emasculated. I think they felt powerless. And we won.
That we, as students, have the power to make history. We made history. That was the big lesson for me. And I've tried ever since to use that knowledge to change in various small ways the course of American history.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
The origin of the free speech movement at Berkeley, it grew out of the civil rights movement. We've been very active in organizing for civil rights, both participation in the South and civil rights issues in Berkeley and Oakland. We had been picketing the Republican National Convention in San Francisco in the summer. And Noland, who was the head of Goldwater's campaign for president that year, and owned the Oakland Tribune, and was a regent, put pressure on UC to shut down political activity.
At the beginning of the term of '64,
a notice came to all the groups that used the collective space in front of the campus to hand out their leaflets about their religious groups and their meetings and their fundraisers. And the notice came and said we could no longer use the space in front of the campus to do that.
One of the things that we could do from our station in Berkeley was to try to generate funds and sympathy for the movement in the South, the civil rights movement, by organizing on campus. We did that by standing on the free speech part of the sidewalk while it was still open to public discourse, not claimed by the regents, by virtue of putting a metal plaque in the bricks of the sidewalk and proclaiming it to be regents' territory.
So the different groups that were affected by this went to the dean that sent out this notice and questioned them about it. And remember that this was a broad spectrum of groups. It was, of course, the big activists at that time were the civil rights organizations that were organizing demonstrations, the farm workers organization. I was most involved with that. And we went to them all together, all the groups that were affected. We went to them and they saw how many groups and how upset we were. And they soon turned around and said, well, wait a minute. This doesn't really apply to all of you. Yes, we said it's about mess and dropped leaflets, but actually, the problem is the people who are organizing demonstrations and activities that go off campus. The rest of you can keep on doing this. Well, when they said that, we realized what the situation was.
You know, here we're going full speed ahead, and we come to this brick wall that says you can't do that anymore. So it diverted all of our attention, most of our attention, a lot of our attention, to what we considered a free speech issue.
That's what got Jack Weinberg into trouble. He was at a table representing, I believe it was the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. Jack was a former student at the time, which made him a good target.
They drove the police car onto the campus, they put Jack in it, and spontaneously hundreds of people sat down around the police car.
That was a tactical mistake of the first order. When students saw that police car driving onto campus where no vehicle had ever driven before, that was a place where students walked and played and lounged and caught up on their reading. But to see a police car move onto our campus and park, and to see somebody physically manhandled, dragged away from a table, and tossed into a police car was extremely disturbing.
And we held that car for about 32 hours until there was a negotiated settlement that the administration promised to negotiate with us the issues of freedom of speech. It said it would book Jack Weinberg, but it would not press charges against him, so he would be released. And it promised, the administration promised, that there would be no disciplinary actions against the students who had previously been at the tables, whose names had been taken by the deans in the days preceding this sit down around the police car.
Obviously, the students were not happy. And that's where we learned, many of us learned the Latin phrase in loco parentis for the first time. We realized that the university was not ready to treat us like adults. We were considered to be a subclass of human being that required constant surveillance.
The administration seemed to never be in good faith. They would expel students who were caught doing political activity on campus, speaking out, having rallies. And more picketing, another sit-in, and then they'd say, it's okay, and then they wouldn't follow through. Everything that they did helped support the growth of our movement because the administration made so many really politically bad decisions.
Over the Thanksgiving holiday, students whose names had been taken the previous fall, that is in September, for various protests, were cited by the administration for disciplinary action, which had been explicitly forbidden in the agreement we had reached with the administration to end that protest around the police car back in September. We gave the administration an ultimatum. We said, withdraw the disciplinary action against those students and grant full freedom of speech to all students on the campus, where we will occupy the administration building, which is Sproul Hall.
The events leading up to the sit-in were portentous, I would say. There was plenty of warning, and we came to the rally being told that it's a possibility we may be sitting in. I came there, I had my recorder with me, and I was in the crowd, and I saw from the side the speeches. I can hear Mario Savio making his famous statement about put your bodies on the wheels and the gears and all the levers. We formed a community out of that student body. And the way I felt was, in effect, history has caught up to me. I don't really have much of a choice. This is what it's come to. I've been helping with it. I don't just walk away at this point, because if I do that, I walk away from a significant part of myself.
We sat in to stop the university from working because they denied that students could have the same rights as outside people to say what they wanted within the limits of the First and 14th Amendments of the Constitution and within the limits of neatness and not dropping leaflets. We all agreed with that. And they stopped us from doing it. And we decided, for the sake of publicity and for the sake of expressing ourselves, that we were going to stop them from running.
There was no violence against property. The only thing that we threw against the wall inside Sproul Hall that night was a projected screening of Charlie Chaplin's Gold Rush. We didn't do any damage to the place.
That balcony is where, I mean, we were in there for over 12 hours. So we got up and walked around and did different activities. But at one point, there was a picture of me standing on that center balcony.
When I was dragged down the steps, the marble steps of the interior of that building, by two police officers, one dragging me down by my ankles, and the other used his free foot to stomp on my leg with his boot. That was his contribution to the process of moving me down those stairs. We got to the basement. The second officer pulled me up on my feet, pinned my arms behind my back, and the other officer slapped me in the face twice. And then they put me in a pain-compliant hand cramp, twisting my hand backwards over my wrist to the point that it became very painful, and marched me to a bus and thence to jail. It was a civil trial that was adjudicated by the state of California. We were accused of trespassing or refusing to leave the scene of a rout, not a riot, but a rout. Well, apparently a riot is when you are physically active and resisting. I'm not sure, but given our deportment, I would say that a rout is something that occurs when a bunch of people sit down and sing songs.
The funny thing is, at our trials, some of us were given higher charges. I was given a higher charge. A lot of others, a couple of dozen were higher charges. I was charged with hitting a policeman. And our lawyers got me to stand up. Remember, I was 4'11" then, I'm a little shorter now. And he said, "Is this the woman who charged the policeman?" Well, of course, the policeman didn't know, and they all laughed. And then they said, and you predict that this person will be a recidivist trespasser?
I was photographed there with other students, of course, at the time when the police came and charged to try to get through the windows and seize the microphone that was being used from the balcony. Of course, the microphone was dropped to people below, and we in that room began shouting, "Go home, go home, go home," in unison, and it certainly looked as if the police suddenly lost their aggressive demeanor.
And then at about 2 or 3 in the morning, they decided to arrest us. And the police came in, and I was sitting on the second floor near the windows, right at the top of the stairs. And this was the Alameda County Sheriff's. And they had very high black boots. And one of them just kicked me right in the head, just kicked me in the head. Had a huge egg right here by the time I got to jail. So they started arresting everybody. The fact that they had arrested so many of us, the fact that the police had come onto the campus, galvanized the faculty. For the first time, it really galvanized the faculty. And the next day, the faculty met and came up with the resolution that the administration eventually accepted, which is that no laws save the First Amendment apply to students on campus. And I remember at the victory rally, one of the things that I loved the most that Mario said was, yay, we won, and it isn't wonder, and it's a great victory, and we're all just euphoric. And now that we have the right to say and the right to free speech, we have the responsibility to have responsible speech.
What happened was someone sat down in front of the campus with a sign that said, "I still can't say that," F-U-C-K. I mean, I'm an old person. I can't talk like that. I don't think it's immoral. I just can't do it. So somebody sat down with a sign. Now remember that we had won completely. The university finally agreed that they will make no laws restricting the expression of speech on campus. Students will have the same rights as anybody else, except that they will make laws about time, place, and manner in the sense of, you can't crowd certain spots, you can't drop your leaflets. So we won 100%. And then a guy sat down in front of the campus with that sign. And the brilliant university president himself brought publicity to that. Called all the newspapers, arrested him, made a big thing, and named it the filthy speech movement. And the idea, I suppose, was to be able to say, what can a poor university president do? I have no rights. I can't stop anybody from doing anything. We have to regulate speech in some way. So the free speech movement still existed as an executive committee and the question was, well, should we go to his defense? Well, as I said, you heard me. I couldn't say that word. We were all of another generation. We did not instinctively think this was most of us did not think this was a great development. Oh gosh, the world's opening up. On the other hand, it was speech. What should we do? We really couldn't decide what to do. Should we call? Ultimately, we decided to do nothing and call a lawyer, but everybody got together and they said, look, we will become a brake on the movement. We can't afford to keep doing this. We can't become, we don't have a function to serve. We can't, it shouldn't be a question of what does the free speech movement say about this. We actually dissolved ourselves. At least that was the main issue. I suppose some of us thought the movement would be taken over by one or the other faction in the movement, but, and I think we made a big mistake.
We are going to be the kids that you read about in textbooks, not because we are going to be another statistic about mass shootings in America, but because, just as David said, we are going to be the last mass shooting.
I think the voice of youth is just as powerful today as it was in the 1960s. If in fact the Florida youth, if Emma Gonzalez and her fellow students, if they form a movement, and if they go to the legislature, if they don't go to school, if they have boycotts, they're going to win. They're going to win. It takes dedication and rational planning and self-care, but they can win. I mean, I think that I don't think that I could ever get as indignant as I felt then. I was so indignant, and it filled my body and propelled all of my actions and my whole reason. You know, I wanted to dedicate myself to eradicating these wrongs. That became more important than any career goal I had. And I think it's absolutely true today. Absolutely true that they have the power.
That us kids don't know what we're talking about, that we're too young to understand how the government works. We call BS! If you agree, register to vote. Contact your local congresspeople. Give them a piece of your mind.
In the end, my journey finally brought me back to New York, 8,060 miles later. In the process, I learned about lines, thick ones and fine ones, and there is a difference. The thick ones are what everyone knows. Oppression is bad in every sense of the word on a college campus, and it must be stopped. The fine line is, where do we draw these lines? And are they lines in the sand that can be altered? They sure are. That's where I learned something. I wanted to get a diploma revoked, but now I don't. It would be nice to have it gone, but if someone, no matter how bad they are, loses their diploma, who should decide they lose it? Is his First Amendment rights not as valid as the rest of ours? By saying his First Amendment rights don't matter, it cheapens the whole system. People died and were beaten just so they could speak up and be heard. Life changes over time, and so does protest. But as long as people have a voice, protest will always stay constant.